short presentation on the health risk assessment, and we have Greg Chittick and Luis Perez from MRS Environmental here as well for questions. Just a quick note on Greg and I's air quality experience. We've been doing this for about 30 years, and between the two of us, we've done health risk assessments for Bay Area Air Quality Management District, San Luis Obispo, Ventura, and Santa County for pollution control districts, as well as the South Coast Air Quality Management District. So I think what would be best for us tonight is I'll go through the presentation and then we'll get to questions. But if you do have a question on one of the slides, to the slide, go ahead and jump in. And at the end, I can also go through how you can get a specific risk value for a specific receptor, such as your house, by using the data in Appendix E of the report. Okay, real quick, I wanted to just touch on the air toxics hotspots program, which is the regulatory requirement that started the health risk assessment process. Stationary sources are required, certain ones are required to report to CARB or the local districts emissions, specifically toxic air contaminant emissions. There's over 500 toxic substances right now in the program. And I should note that for this specific health risk assessment, we also included mobile sources, which makes this health risk assessment much more comprehensive than one that would be required by the air district for the 2588 program. And so the one that we've done here is more equivalent to a health risk assessment done for the CEQA process or the environmental impact review process. Also should note that the toxic air contaminants or TACs that we have here for this analysis are specific to do not include other area sources such as the traffic, the airport, and other industrial type sources in the area. Okay, this is something we talked about in August at the CAP, the bottling methodology. We went through a little bit of that back then. And what's important here is that this process is it's a state process run by OHIA, the Office of Health Hazard Assessment, and it follows specific protocols and procedures that are, that have been reviewed and vetted by both the state and the local air quality management districts. And for this particular analysis, we went through and submitted all of our inputs to the South Coast Air Quality District ahead of time, and they went through, made a couple comments, and approved our approach. And in addition to that, the actual emissions, the toxic air contaminant emissions, are also submitted on an annual basis to the Air Quality Management District, and those were looked at for this analysis as well and approved for this study. Okay. Getting to the specific study that Greg completed, we had two operating scenarios I want to just introduce. We talked about these in August as well, and we've been talking about them at the CAP when we've been looking at this over the last few months. The first one is last year's actual emissions from the operating year 2019. As we've all been talking about at the CAP all these months, there's no drilling, and there has been no drilling at the oil field since June 2014. And so what we're calling the operating year 2019, or the normal operating year, does not include drilling and is typical of what's been going on at the field for the last 5 or 6 years. Those bulleted items on the bottom are the sources of the tax that we included in the report. We talked about these in August as well a bit. Of course, the first one is not included in the 2019 year because there were no drilling. But everything else listed there, the maintenance rigs, the testing of emergency and fire water pump diesel engines, the heaters at the gas plant, the storage tanks, testing of the flare, all the well heads, all the wells, the well cellars, all the fugitive components associated with the piping and all of that stuff that's associated with getting the fluids from the wellheads to the gas plant, any construction equipment. And as I noted earlier, we did include mobile sources in this analysis, so that would include on-site vehicles, both personal vehicles and diesel trucks, gas-operated pickup trucks, etc. And then the last bullet notes that we include fugitive dust from the vehicle activity on the field. Okay, so for the other operating scenario, we did what we call the future worst case operating scenario, and that involved drilling all of the wells that would be allowed under the CSD, which was a total of 500. So given the number of years between now and the end of the CSD in 2028, that works out to be 46 wells per year. So for the worst case operating scenario, it's everything that we would have seen in the 2019 or any other subsequent operating year, plus drilling of 46 wells per year, and the increase in emissions from the operations that would be associated with an increase in throughput of that oil that would be produced. So this worst case scenario assumes that this level of operation would continue into the future post 2028. Okay, here I just want to touch real quick on the risk assessment result terms, I guess you could call them. The health risk assessment calculates 3 types of risk: acute, chronic, and cancer. We talk about the cancer risk often. It is the number that most people are interested in, and that's the one that has the threshold of 10 in a million. When they do the SNAPS project, they'll probably come up with a number for this, for the cancer risk as well. The acute impacts are associated with non-cancer, short-term, 1-hour peak exposure. These are to some of the more potent chemicals that have short-term issues. Chronic health impacts are the longer-term impacts that are non-cancer. And then the cancer risk is the potential for getting health effects from exposure to these carcinogenic type pollutants.
Hey, Dean, we have some questions from some of the previous slides. Do you want to wait towards the end, or?
We can catch them right now if you want.
Okay, I'll allow Melanie to.
I just want to make sure we have time to get through all the slides, but yeah, let's grab those questions now. That's fine.
Okay, go ahead, Melanie.
Hi. On that slide that you were just on with the bulleted list, that one.
Okay.
Under which of those bullets does plug and abandonment operations fall?
That would fall under the well maintenance rig diesel engines. The plug and abandonment P&As, they use the well maintenance rig vehicles, I guess you call them, or infrastructure.
Mm-hmm. And then under the next slide, where you look at a worst case scenario, when we're talking about 46 wells per year, I assume that's being drilled. Again, what accommodation assumptions have you made for continued plug and abandonment? Because I think we're looking at, as well as ongoing maintenance, but I think we're currently targeting 12 wells per year on average, if needed. Could you clarify?
For P&Aing of the wells, plugging and abandoning?
For the worst case scenario assumptions, you indicate 46 wells per year. I assume that's for drilling?
That's for drilling brand new wells, yes.
And so,
and that would be unlikely given the fact that the CSD limits the operator to 2 drill rigs on site at any given time. So if you look at the numbers there, it would be very difficult to drill that many wells in 1 year with only 2 drill rigs. But for worst case, we went ahead and went with that.
okay.
So your question is more about the plugging and abandonment number?
So again, I'm wondering under this worst assumptions for this scenario, how many wells are also being assumed for plug and abandonment operation during a year?
I don't have that in front of me. I think the report notes 10. Greg, do you know that number?
Yeah, we assumed the average that's been done historically, and we have that in the report, and I think it's 5 to 6 per year. So your number of 12 would be a little over what we had assumed moving forward.
Okay, well, I think that's true for 2019, but I think in 2019, Sentinel, I thought they had announced that they were going to try and target 12 wells per year, and I think that's what the current drilling plan indicates. So that I will take a look at that.
Okay. Yeah, we assume 5.5 wells, 5 to 6 wells abandoned per year.
Okay. Did you have another question, Edgar?
Yeah, so one was, let's see, regarding taking questions at next month. We will take questions about this report next month. There's a question about the AQMD. Who was contacted at SCA AQMD for this report? Do you guys have that answer? Who you guys talked to at AQMD?
Yeah,
Greg,
we worked with Tracy Goss, who's the head of their health risk assessment division, and some of his staff, and we also forwarded him. They've seen the final report as well.
Okay, thank you. And then let's see. There's no plan to drill 46 wells, right? I think you addressed already that question. Let's see. We have one more question on here. King G.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes. My question is, how many maintenance rigs did you run in 2019 and then in 2020?
Well, as we've been discussing at the CAP, and maybe Dan or
Yeah, I think it's, I don't have a summary in front of me, but
3 a month.
we're about 3 rigs a month right now, I believe, maintenance rigs. Seems to be the average. I'd have to go back and look at all the reports to give you a firm number, but 3, maybe some months 4.
Oh, okay.
And
All
if
right.
there's a concern, Dean, can I add a little bit of clarity, hopefully?
Sure.
I think if there's a concern that for the worst case scenario, we would be doing maintenance rigs and drilling wells and then plugging wells, and we're adding all these rigs up, we would not pick up any extra maintenance rigs. Instead of doing workovers, we would just divert the rigs to the plug and abandonment project. So it wouldn't cause an increase in rig work or emissions.
I see. Thank you for the clarification. Appreciate it.
Yeah, and we received information from SPR on their 2019 total rig hours, and we used that information in 2019. And then moving forward for the future worst case, we used the worst case allowed by the CSD, which is 8 rigs, I believe, operating in the field at all times.
Okay.
Okay.
So we also have a question from Christine DeRosa.
Hi, I have a question about if you're estimating, well, you're using emissions from 2019, but there were no wells drilled in 2019. How are you estimating what the emissions are from drilling wells?
Well, that would be in our worst case scenario.
Right?
We're not estimating impacts from drilling of wells for the 2019 scenario because, as you just noted, there were no wells drilled, and that represents sort of what the field's been doing for the last since 2015 for the last
Dean,
5-6 years.
you got Dean. I bet you guys are using published data for the emissions for the rigs with the known engines that we have on the rigs. Greg, is that what you're doing?
Yes, that's what we're doing, and
Yeah,
we're
I think
assuming,
that's the answer to your question, Dean.
Yeah, and we also have a lot of good historical data of when drilling was done at the field, as well as at other fields in terms of fuel use and load factors and and what the emissions are and how they're operated, what other pieces of equipment they use, some construction equipment as well when they're doing drilling, forklifts, that type of thing. And so how much the generators run. And so we have a lot of good data, and we use that historical based data. Even though SPR hasn't done much drilling, drilling has been done at the field historically.
Okay, thank you.
And then one final question in the comments from Monica is how many rework assumed in worst case scenario in addition to the 46 new wells and the 5 to 6 plug and abandonment?
So the reworking assumes the CSD allowed 8 rigs in the field at one time.
Yeah.
And that's the worst case.
And we would not pick up additional rigs for plug and abandon. As I mentioned, we would just divert some of those rigs to abandonment projects if it came to that. It wouldn't be like we would work 8 workover rigs and then bring in 2 to plug and abandon. We would never do that.
Okay, thank you. I think that's all the questions for now. Keep moving forward.
Okay, let's step into the results then. Here's the results along with the results from the 2008 HRA that was done for the CSD Environmental Impact Report. I've also put in the numbers from the SDI air quality study. And then the last 2 columns on the right, of course, are the 2019 operation scenario and then the worst case operation scenario with the 46 wells. Acute, chronic, and cancer risk thresholds are there in red. As you can see, the studies to date have shown that the health risk from the IOF operations have not been above the thresholds to date. The worst case scenario cancer risk as a residence was calculated at 5.6. You can see that the worst case result for cancer risk is over the threshold of 10 at 13.8. And I'm going to show you where that is when we get to the maps in a couple of slides. The next slide shows some more expanded results we can look at. The first few rows are for the operating scenario of 2019. The last group below is for the worst case. You can see that all of the numbers, including the worst case drilling scenario, are below the thresholds, with the exception of the PMI, which is the point of maximum impact, the maximum number, which again was 13.8, and it's along the fence line, which I'll show you in a minute when we get to the maps. Okay, so here we've got the acute impact map for the 2019 operating scenario. The numbers were low, so those isopleths in blue and yellow represent 0.1 and 0.5 of the hazard index threshold. And you can see that for the half of the threshold, the yellow, all of those receptors are within the boundary except for maybe a couple on that eastern edge there. And then the blue line is also mostly inside the fence line, but it does go outside the fence line in a few spots, including the eastern part towards Kennethon Park. Moving to the cancer risk map, also for the 2019 operating scenario, the threshold value, which is 10, is shown in the red isopleth, 5 in a million is in the yellow, and 1 in a million is in blue. So maybe we could stop here if people have questions on the graphics here. Maybe it's a good spot to stop for a second.
Yeah, I have a question, Dean. Charles here.
Go ahead.
Yeah, can just to get me grounded on the numbers, that 13.8, that's 13.8 mortalities per million people over what time frame, or is it just a dimensionless number? Is it just a relative number?
Well, it represents 13.8 potential cancers in a million population.
Over what time period?
Over 30 years.
Over 30 years. So that's on a normal That's under your normal operating conditions. That's what the risk assessment says. Okay.
Well, the 13.8 was for the worst case.
For the worst case.
For the normal operating, we didn't have any go over the threshold of 10. The highest number was again 5.2, and the highest maximum number for any residential was 1.0 essentially. So
Okay.
that would be 1/10 of the standard.
Is it safe for me to assume that the 13.8 is the maximum number that would affect the community? There's no synergies between the three things that might make them more. In other words, the cancer might be exacerbated by an acute or a chronic issue that's non-cancer itself. Is there any data to suggest that they operate independently?
No, that number would be your maximum cancer risk. And when we get to the Appendix E discussion, you can see that cancer risk is calculated by a number of factors, not just inhalation.
I saw in one of your charts that there was a factor of 10 mismatch between your data and the STI data. Can you account for that? The other one. Yeah, chronic, just going back, the other one, sorry, yeah.
This one.
Yeah, the air quality and the 2008. Oh, I'm sorry. That was 2008. My apologies. Okay.
Right, and remember again that the 2008 EIR was done similar to this one using actual emissions and then measured emissions from what was calculated, submitted to the AQMD as emission reports, whereas the STI air quality sampled the air around the field. So it's a little bit of a different source of where they got the toxic air contaminant numbers from. One was submitted as actual emissions to the AQMD, and the second one, the STI, was what the SNAPS is going to do, which actually measure toxic air contaminants in the air, which is a different approach, but you're getting to the same answer.
Okay. Two quick questions, and I'll be done. Based on what you're seeing here, you don't see any safety implications for your people who are on the field themselves, that you're going to make any changes, right?
Well, that's interesting. That's a good question. Yes, because the health risk assessment, the AB 2588 regulation and process is all about calculating the potential health risk to the population surrounding a stationary source, whereas it's kind of awkward to put it that way, but the people that actually work in the field, they don't count, so to speak, in this.
They're the canaries.
Well, they're also under a different set of rules, which is the OSHA. OSHA protects workers, and they're on the field for 8 hours. They don't live next to the field full time, so it's a different exposure. It's a whole different sort of regulation calculating the risk to the workers.
Okay,
So maybe
fair enough.
they're a canary in some respects, perhaps, if you want to look at it that way.
So Charles, if it helps, I think that the exposure that you would have is less because you are less time at the oil field, and the calculations that are being done under this model are for 30 years of exposure, 24 hours a day. For people that work there, they're going to be exposed substantially less than that, if that helps you.
Okay, I'm actually losing my internet connection, but I just want to say that when you have a spill, when you actually have a spill where you calculate the maximum benzene or the maximum hazard, how does that momentary 15-minute or half-hour high exposure compare to your acute and your chronic thing? How should the community look at that in terms of impact, safety impact?
Well,
what you're saying is you're saying that everything's good except for the worst case. But if you have a momentary exposure, a half hour, like what happened in a couple of years ago, how does that impact the safety of the exposed community?
Well, for the The health risk assessment does not.
Is it a
take into
non-event? I
account-
mean, just because it's so short? Yeah.
No, it's a different approach to looking at those impacts. So the health risk assessment for the short term, you want to say acute impacts, something that would happen within an hour. The health risk assessment calculates the potential for those types of acute impacts to the community from those acute chemicals that are being used at the facility. So it wouldn't capture the spill, like for example, the Thanksgiving spill, it wouldn't capture that because that wasn't a normal operation. Those emissions don't usually exist. For the Thanksgiving example, what the county did with MRS's assistance is we ran the exposure model and calculated the impact to the community for that. And then to determine those impacts, we presented those at the CAP. And then in addition to address that problem, we went back and had the operator install redundant systems on those tanks that had the high volatile organic compound, those odorous compounds in those tanks. Most of them were called wash tanks. So all of those tanks have been retrofitted with new redundant systems to prevent that from happening again. So two different exposure pathways, both are being addressed by the county, I guess, in a different way.
Okay.
If that helps.
Yeah, and one other consideration, Charles, is that if you think about 30 years of exposure, a 5 to 15-minute incident is not going to add substantially to those 30 years of exposure, especially because it's a mishap situation that is not occurring regularly at the oil field. Again, it was an emergency situation. It was something that happened, but it's not a normal part of operation. And so when you look at it that way, and when you consider that 5 to 15-minute exposure and the 30-year overall exposure is negligible at best.
Okay. Thank you.
Dean, this is Jim Limbaugh. A quick question about the two green markers on the college grounds. They're noted as sensitive receptors. Dean?
Yes, where you have schools, those are schools, hospitals, senior citizen homes. Those types of receptors are deemed sensitive receptors because that population, because they're either old or young, have different, are more susceptible to the impacts from these chemicals. So when you have sensitive receptors in your receptor grid, those are noted as such.
So it's a marker for the locale or the function. There's not literally a receptor apparatus on my campus.
Correct.
Okay, thank you for explaining.
Yeah, you'll see that when we go and look at the Appendix E output at the end here, you'll see more of that, how the receptor grid sort of plays out.
Okay, thank you.
This next map, if you want to move on, is the cancer risk from the worst case operating scenario.
We have a few more questions. Tim,
Okay.
Tim has some questions.
Right, actually, yeah, it was my question. I think the next map might actually identify it. Because looking at the aerial view, the one prior to the worst case scenario, all of the area was enclosed by the colors. There's no population there. So what are the numbers based on if there's no people living within the area that the map covered? That's one. And second, with the wind patterns, is it assumed that all of the pollutants and carcinogens go straight up, come right back down and stay within the boundaries?
I'm going to let Greg answer the first question, but on the latter question, no. There's 5 years of meteorological data set used for this analysis. So when these chemicals come out of a, say, for a smokestack, for example, if for that given hour of day, those chemicals move where the meteorological conditions for that specific hour of day would take them. So if it was blowing strong to the west, they would go to the east. They'd be blown in that direction.
And that's one of the reasons that you have sort of odd looking shapes, because you're taking 5 years of hourly data, and it generates a lot of different scenarios, and so it creates sometimes some sort of strange looking shapes because of all of those different scenarios associated with each hour. And you assume in the model that there's somebody everywhere. So you run the cancer risk even for the middle of the oil field, assuming that somebody was living in the middle of the oil field for 30 years. Now, obviously that's not happening. So that's when you actually need to take the results and apply some logic and reasoning. The South Coast, for example, looks primarily at for cancer risk because it's a 30-year exposure. They look at, residences where there's actually a house. Whereas for acute exposure, which is just 1 hour, basically anywhere that's outside the facility fence line, right at the facility fence line, they assume that somebody could be there for an hour. So the model doesn't really take into account where people actually are. You have to take the results and then figure that out yourself.
Okay, and also given the fact that the oil field's been there since 1924, aren't there actually real numbers and real results and tests, research that could have been done, and it has been done on the surrounding communities?
Yeah, yes, there are. I know that, the Department of Health did a study a few years ago. I'm not as familiar with it as Dean and Louise are, but they did some epidemiological type of test studies to look at what the cancer risks are in the community.
How does that match up with the models that we're looking at right now?
Well, if I remember, go ahead, Louise.
So what they did in that study was essentially a comparison of mortality, morbidity data, cancer risk, and so on. And they compared the census tracts surrounding the oil field with the county at large. And what they found was that there was no significant difference, a statistically significant difference between the area or the population surrounding the oil field and the county of LA at large. I know that there was some dissatisfaction with those public health studies, and that's why there is also a public health study that is under review and eventual preparation that would also come in the heels of the SNAP study. And so what we're seeing now is this HRA, there will be the SNAP study, which will take actual measurements of the emissions at the field, just like the STI study did a few years ago. And then subsequent to that, I believe that public health would have its own study to try to determine if there is any, statistically significant difference between the health risk surrounding the oil field for those communities and other communities that are similar to it.
And lastly, gentlemen, I can appreciate the county doing other tests relative to other areas. I'm sure if they compare it to Exide Battery area in the East Los Angeles, we probably would have skewed results. But my question would be, is there a report that shows from 1924 and 30-year increments the morbidity within this particular area relative and compared to models that you're using right now? See whether or not the models themselves have any real basis in fact within the last, almost 100 years?
I'm not aware of a long-term study like that.
Yeah, one of the things, we look at the emissions, and what the STI study did is they looked at emissions of, in particular, the diesel particulates for a year surrounding the oil field, and tried to then determine what the health risk associated with those emissions will be. And that study is available at the county and SPR's website for your review. There is also a study, the other studies that are done are conducted by the Air Quality Management District, and they do their MATE study. And what the MATE study does is it calculates what the toxic emissions are throughout the Southland. And Dean's going to talk later about the results of the MATE study, because what that does is it gives you what the background excess cancer risk is for the Southland area. And so that may help contextualize this a little bit. And I think what you're trying to get at is what are the cancer, you know, if the field has been there since the 1920s, and if you're able to do a study, can you determine that the cancer has been higher in this area or the surrounding community than elsewhere in general populations? And I think that, I don't know that we can answer that question unequivocally, but certainly all the studies that we have done, both by measuring emissions and by doing the models, show that the contribution of the oil field, particularly in the later years since the CSD has been instituted, do not provide a substantial contribution to the existing cancer risk.
This is David. I just wanted to add, and I know Mr. Jones is on the right track in terms of, is there a baseline? And from my understanding in dealing with the CSD for the last, I don't even count the years now, 15 years, we are in the middle of creating the baseline that will be looked at, you know, down the line, you know, 20 years from now. And if we can get the information correct and get it a baseline that is, you know, tested and consistent, then we'll be able to start looking at the items that are coming off the field and how they're having an impact. But trying to compare pre-1924, pre-oil discovery, and the communities that lived around it and the environmental impacts, you know, of those communities and their comorbidities, epidemiology that would actually align with that would probably be completely different than what we're dealing with here today. And it might be the same way 100 years from now. There might be a whole different story. My assumption is there won't be oil drilling 100 years from now. So we'll leave it at that.
Okay, there's a question from Melanie.
Hi, yeah, my question is on the previous slide, the cancer risk for 2019 scenario. Could you identify what the three red dots are, the MEIW, MEIR, and the middle one?
I might have skipped over that when we were looking at the results here. The bottom of this slide explains what those are. And the PMI is the point of maximum impact. That's the highest number of anywhere in the receptor grid. And then the MEIR is the highest maximally exposed individual resident receptor. And then the MEIW is for worker. So if we go back here to here.
And I want to clarify, Dean, that's outside of the boundaries of the oil field.
Right, outside of the boundaries, yes.
Thank you. That's helpful. And then can you also provide a, because they look like they're, well, those dots, they look like they're right on the edge of the oil field then. So
Correct.
Can you also provide an explanation for the three blue non-contiguous circles off to the top right area?
So you see that's if you look at the terrain, those are higher areas in the terrain. And so because of some of the sources are stack sources, dispersion will go upwards because of its temperature, and therefore it can affect areas that are higher more than areas that are lower. And so you get those three little anomalies there, which is part of what the map model was calculating.
So then using that explanation and comparing it to the next map where the circles get absorbed in the larger ring, that's the result of a higher volume of emissions affecting the area. Okay, thank you.
Exactly. Thank you.
And then one last question from Christine DeRosa.
Okay.
Hi, it's not a question. Christine DeRosa with Public Health. I'd like to clarify the public health study that was done. I've heard a few times.
Did we
Christine?
lose Christine? Christine?
Steve?
I'm here. I was changed to
Okay.
panelist. So you can go ahead and change me back. I've heard a couple times that the public health study is characterized as finding no significant difference in cancer rates. So this is back to Mr. Jones's question. In cancer rates in the populations that are surrounding the oil field. And that is true with a caveat. The study was unable to answer the question. And that's the thing that I think needs to be really clear, is that because there were so few cancers and because you don't have it at a really specific geographic level, it's unlikely to come up with a result if you did it again today. If you do it the same way, you're going to get the same result. And it doesn't mean that there aren't excess cancers. It means we didn't find any. It doesn't mean that they aren't there. It's that our methodology was not sufficient to find them. So I just wanted to clarify that point. So it's a null finding with the caveat that the methodology wouldn't have necessarily found it anyway.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Okay, we can continue going, Dean.
Okay, so I think we've talked about this one enough with our questions, but this again is the worst case operating scenario cancer risk map. You can see the 10 in a million is for the most part within the oil field, and the 5 in a million, which is half the threshold, is also mostly within the fence line. And that's for the worst case drilling. I put this slide in here as the next one to just sort of touch base on, we talked about in August about how one of the drivers to redo the health risk assessment from when it was done in 2008 was not only because the emissions have potentially changed at the oil field, but also because of the methodology has changed. So this analysis used the updated OHIA guideline requirements, which is 2 to 3 times more conservative. So in that respect, we would see that the results from this analysis versus the 2008 one done for the EIR would be higher. Sort of opposing that is the fact that this analysis in 2020 used the 2019 emissions, and those emissions are related from the use of much different diesel engines than that were available back in 2008, or I should say were required in 2008. The CARB mandated cleaner engine requirements that have been going on since 2008 have gone through several iterations of requirements for cleaner engines, and we're now at what they call CARB Tier 4, which again are significantly cleaner than the emissions, than the engines that were used in 2008. When I say cleaner, I mean the emissions, there's just less emissions, and with particular emphasis, these new engines are much better on diesel particulate, which is a big, one of the larger TAC risk drivers for cancer risk. And that's because they actually have particulate filters that captured 90% or more of the emissions that were previously escaping into the atmosphere. So with those cleaner engines, we would expect to see the HRA results would be lower than 2008. But with the more conservative guideline requirements, you expect them to be higher. And so what we saw, at the end of the day, after all the modeling was done, is that the results are similar, sort of for cancer risk at any rate, sort of about halfway to the standard, 5 in both cases. And we didn't know where we would get until we ran the model because of these different considerations, but that's where the numbers ended up. So yeah, go ahead.
You have a question from Deborah?
Hi, and thank you. Happy holidays to everybody. This information is fascinating, but my burning question is this. Let's put it this way. Has anybody interviewed cancer patients done outreach to get accurate numbers. I had part of my right lung removed last month. My neighbor died of cancer, lung cancer, and another neighbor across the alley from me and adjacent, right across from the neighbor who lived next to me who died of lung cancer, also died of lung cancer recently. So I'm actually questioning the accuracy of the numbers that are going into the cancer data pool.
Well, to kind of on those thoughts, let's go to the next slide, which I put in to sort of put in kind of a big picture kind of overview. Luis had mentioned the MATES program a few minutes ago, which is the multiple air toxic exposure study. And this program has various monitoring sites throughout the LA basin, and it's collecting data very similar to what SNAPS is going to do of toxic air contaminants in the LA basin. And they've used all this data. They're now working on MATES number 5. I've got the numbers for MATES 3 and 4. These studies usually take about 5 years to run. They've calculated a cancer risk for the entire LA basin based on all the data they've collected from these various monitoring sites throughout the area. And with regards to cancer risk, the threshold again is in red. These are numbers in a million. 853 was what was calculated for MATES 3. MATES 4, you can see a significant drop in cancer, but it's still well above what OHIA determines to be the threshold, which is 10. So the air quality in the basin it could be better. But it is a positive sign to see the numbers drop. You know, that's a 57% or so reduction in cancer risk from the MATES 3 study to the MATES 4 study, which was completed a year or so ago. The next line below that is the cancer risk using revised guidelines. And I just put in what MATES calculated versus what we have for the Inglewood oil field. And again, you know, as the bullet said at the bottom of the slide sort of note, you know, the MATES studies considers thousands of sources throughout the basin, and Inglewood oil field is certainly one of those sources, but its individual contribution to the total is under the threshold. As far as cancer for certain specific individuals, I'm not sure how I could answer that question.
Yeah, what this is telling you essentially is that the existing background, based on all the emissions that occurred in the LA basin, is producing a cancer risk that is above the threshold. So you would experience, you know, cancer risk throughout the area because of the emissions that you have in the LA basin. There's a lot of pollutants. There's a lot of trucks riding on the highways. There's a lot of cars riding on the highways, all of them producing a substantial amount of pollution. And even though engines have been cleaned up over the years, you still have a substantial existing baseline cancer risk that you're exposed to. And so it is not surprising that you will find, you know, a level of, you know, some cancers in various areas. What we're measuring here, and, you know, we provide this information on the MATES study so that people understand that the LA basin has a substantial risk. What this study does is it tries to ascertain what is the contribution of the emissions of the oil field to that existing cancer risk. And so, you know, I think that we're not suggesting that there isn't any cancer or that there, you know, people don't have an exposure to those toxics. We're just sort of measuring what is it that the contribution of the oil field is to that background cancer, and with the understanding that the AQMD has developed a threshold of 10, and what we're showing you is that the for the 2019 case study, it's lower than that 10 number, and that when you run up to the maximum level, you exceed that number.
Could I ask regarding, Is there any way that this study has looked at removing the mobile sources and just looking at stationary sources for that kind of reference?
Are you referring to the MATE study?
Yeah, this slide mentions stationary and mobile sources, and I was wondering if you excluded mobile sources, would it be different in terms of contribution and threshold? Meaning, are there sites that exist in the basin that are emitting, stationary sites that are emitting, proportionally, what kind of emissions are we talking about versus comparing them to diesel trucks driving on the 5 and in cars on the freeway?
Well, given the fact that the MATES, the numbers are based on monitoring, I don't know that they can separate out mobile versus stationary. Because like the SNAP, it's going to be actual, monitoring stations that collect the toxic air contaminants in the ambient air. So that ambient air is going to contain whatever tax there are in the air from whichever source they happen to originate from. Now, within the MATES document, if they've done that sort of analysis, I'm not sure about that.
Yeah, I think the MATE study also incorporates some modeling. So they do estimate the contributions of different sources. So that is something we could pull out, although I don't know the answer directly to your question.
One other thing on this slide is you look at the MATES 4 number 367, and then you look at the MATES number 897 from the revised guidelines. That shows you that the new guidelines, they really are 2 to 3 times more conservative than the previous methodology. And with those new guidelines, the Inglewood oil field contribution is still below the threshold. So we think that was a positive result.
Okay, there's a question from Tim.
Yeah, all right, thank you very much. Perhaps I'm looking at this too simplistically. We have a threshold. The threshold is 10 cancers per million. We have a worst case scenario that everyone agrees that if that worst case scenario takes effect, it would exceed the threshold. Would it not be common sense to make the worst case scenario less than the amount that would exceed the threshold? I understand 46 wells. It's a thing that you're saying that it's not going to happen, but it is the worst case scenario. If you reduce that number to something that does not exceed 10 per million, would that not be logical?
That's a great question. And actually, that's a question that we've been looking at. And Greg is looking through the modeling results to determine that the number of wells, at least as far as specifically the Inglewood oil field, the number of wells that could be drilled per year to go below that threshold is approximately 25 wells. And that would keep it completely within the oil field instead of just popping out there on that eastern corner where the 13.8 cancer number was for the 46 wells. So that magic number, so to speak, baseball terms, the magic number is 25. And that's something that we've been looking at as, is it something to be discussed? What are the ramifications from looking at that number as 25, and maybe that's some sort of a limit that could be looked at in the future in some type of regulatory analysis. That's a good question.
Dean, I thought the issue was, though, that nobody lives at that point where it's 13.8.
Well, that's correct. However, it's still, with regards to the health risk assessment, that number is outside the fence line. So that does count as an impact over the threshold.
But it would only impact you if you live there, right?
Right, Dan. The South Coast.
Really, so I'm not sure what we're talking about, to be honest.
The AQMD for cancer would look at a residence. It's not, they don't look at the fence line. So that 13.8 number is sort of just, it's important to understand what the PMI number is, but it's not necessarily what the South Coast at least would use to determine whether something was a significant impact.
Okay. We have a question from King G.
Thank you. Since the cancer on the MATE study table there, right there, since these are from modeling studies, so these are probabilities rather than actual incidents. Is that how we should interpret this data?
Well, the MATE study looks at, they have mobile monitors, they have fixed monitors, so they actually measure the values. But then they also do some modeling to understand what different sources might be. And then, but that just gives them the concentrations of the pollutants. And then they use, of course, the same approach that the model that we use, the HART model, uses to estimate what the cancer risk might be from the exposure to those pollutants.
What I'm trying to move toward is to ask the question, has anybody done a correlation study of what the pollutants are and say use USC's cancer stats to do a correlation study by any chance?
I'm not sure we understand the question. Correlating
the pollutants to the actual location of the cancers. Since, you know, you're doing a, this is more a model from what I can see rather than actual model. But if you have actual data, say USC's cancer incidence, epidemiologic data, could you not correlate your pollutant concentration or kind and look at where they're coming from and correlate it on the other axis with cancer incidence and where they're located?
Hey, Christina De Rosa just commented it. She said that the DPH study, that's what it did. We could allow her to, you want to comment on it, Christine?
Sure.
Yeah, I was trying to add a comment in there. So the DPH study did look at the cancer registry data. It didn't look at pollutants because we didn't have that information available for the study, but it did look at the cancer registry data. And again, it's a methodological issue. The numbers are small enough that it's really hard to match that exactly to which pollutants are in the air. You have no measure of how much people are exposed to which particular pollutants. Just because they're in the air doesn't mean that everybody is getting the same dosage.
I see. So to do an actual study, a correlation study, you'll need to get the biological fluids from that individual after they exposed to all these pollutants in the air and see which ones get metabolized to their end products, then sounds like.
Well, and I mean, it's another question that's not about the HRA, that's more about the study, but right. I don't know that would even do it because you don't have an exposure level. You don't have, you know, people aren't walking around with a monitor on them that collects the amount of pollutants in the air that you can then, you know, have them wear that for 30 years and then 30 years later see if they've developed cancer. And then even then there are so many other things that can cause cancer.
Right.
So those studies aren't very realistic at this point.
I see. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Christine. Thank you. Melanie?
Thank you. So my question is going back to the assumptions. Can you clarify for the model when you ran the assumptions, the number of wells and the operations, was it limited to the wells and operations within the CSD boundary? or did it include the entire IOF operations, including the 41 wells and all operations located within the Culver City portion?
It included all of the wells, including the Culver City portion.
Thank you.
Okay, we've continued, Dean.
Okay, well, that's sort of the presentation. I can, if people are curious, we can look at how to get a cancer risk number for a particular receptor. If someone's curious about that, I've got a few slides. I can show you how to step through the Appendix E modeling output if people are curious about that. Or I could just go ahead and do it. It won't take long.
We'll go ahead and do that now.
Okay, if you are curious as to getting a cancer risk number for, or any of the numbers for a particular location, such as your residence or school or whatnot, Greg's included all the modeling output in Appendix E. And in Appendix E, there are several figures that show the receptor grid. This right here is the grid figure. There's also a receptor grid for sensitive receptors and a grid that shows the fence vine receptors. So for example, if you wanted to know the cancer risk for a house located in the where the red arrow is pointed, sort of the middle of the southern end of the field, here's a little bit closer up, you would go to the grid figure, find that receptor number, which in this case happens to be 484. And with that number in mind, you would go to the actual output, the cancer results output, scroll through there. There's pages and pages and pages of it. But if you keep scrolling through, you can find receptor number 484. And that's the model output. And as I mentioned, I think to Charles earlier, that total cancer risk sum is not just from inhalation. There's also risk calculated from soil, dermal, mother's milk, water, fish, beef. Not all of the model of those are used in this specific analysis because we don't have a farm and there's no produce being grown in the field. But you can see that skin and soil numbers are in there calculated. At any rate, take your 484 receptor number, and I just sort of blew it up here so you can see it. There's your receptor 484. Your risk underscore sum is your total risk. And just run your finger across and you get a number 7.55 to the -7. And you take that number and multiply it times 1,000,000 to get your total cancer risk per million. You would come up with about 0.76 cancer risk. So anyone can step through this process if they're curious about a particular location within the receptor grid, and all that data is available for you in Appendix E.
And Dean, once after the meeting and by next week, can I get those slides and I'll post them on the website for everyone to be able to access it?
Sure. So I guess we could have some more questions if
we have a question from Melanie.
Thank you. Thanks for that Appendix E, Dean. That's pretty cool to have that data and be able to try and look at trends. So that's helpful. So my question goes kind of back to what happens now. I know that John has already suggested that this item be agendized for the January meeting so that we might have an opportunity to kind of digest this and then come back with more detailed and specific questions. Kind of related to that, I'm wondering if the county can clarify kind of what the process is with this report now. Does it, once we get through this, does the CAP make any kind of recommendation with it? Does it have to be accepted? And then also another question then for Dean is, you mentioned through the course of your presentation that you worked closely with Sentinel Peak Resources to get the operating information that go into the assumptions with this. Can you just confirm that Sentinel Peak Resources has acknowledged all the assumptions that go in there. Are they reviewing this report too for accuracy assumptions, or has that already been vetted? So that's it.
Well, yeah, we do want to hear from Sentinel Peak, you know, from their review of the report. But the assumptions and the emissions were submitted to South Coast AQMD, and that's what they've submitted every year for their operating toxic air emissions. So, you know, I don't know that Sentinel Peak would have any comment on that. That's what they submit every year. So they've already, you know, that's what's required by the AQMD regulations. As far as discussing the report some more at the next CAP meeting in January, that's we can do that. We're happy to answer questions on it. We're really not putting this report out for sort of to receive comments and address comments about the report or the methodology itself, because there's really no real change that we can make to that we follow the OHIA, CARB, and South Coast AQMD protocols and methodologies. So that's sort of set by, you know, the regulation itself. So the report is basically completed, but we're happy to try to get everyone's questions answered.
Yeah, and Melanie, to respond more to your question, I think you all recall that the genesis of this health risk assessment, in addition to sort of contributing to the SNAPS effort and also to the public health future study effort, it was originally designed to look at in the middle of the periodic review, whether in fact there was anything that we needed to be aware of and not have to wait to do another periodic review to see if something needed to be done, if we had some findings on this health risk assessment that merited some sort of action now. And so I think that we have a lot of information here, and we are working closely with, you know, obviously everybody in the county family to try to understand if there are any recommendations that could be gleaned from this that could be part of the periodic review. And so as you look forward, you know, you're seeing that, you know, we have 7 years left or so for potential drilling at the oil field. And if you're looking at what the operator is doing, the operator right now has not been drilling. They have put in an annual drilling plan, which is also part of the discussion for tonight's agenda, that doesn't even come close to the number of wells that would exceed the thresholds, even at the area of maximum impact, which doesn't leave the oil field. And so, you know, how do we take all this information and consider that to try to establish something as part of the periodic review that makes sense? And I think we're still grappling with this. There are a lot more conversations that need to happen to understand it as to whether there is a need to do something different from the periodic review standpoint. And I think those conversations will be ongoing. And as we continue to do that, that's a public process. And so you all will be aware of that if any recommendations come out of that.
Thank you, Luis. Thanks, Luis. That was the clarification and context I was looking for.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question? Charles here. So I think I understand your report. I think I understand. Basically what you're saying is, based on the models, your operation is within control and the community should not worry about fugitive emissions or hazardous problems with their health. But most of the complaints seem to be periodic. In other words, someone smells something and they're wondering if something has overflown or a relief valve. Is there anything in this that would address these non-typical, non-standard operations that people are smelling, usually late at night? Does it address things like pressure relief valves, stuff like that? I mean, what can the community take from that which says everything is where it should be, with the complaints that seem to arise from time to time?
So I think Greg can answer the majority of this, but I do want to, emphasize that just because there is an odor doesn't necessarily mean that it's creating some sort of toxicity for a resident or for someone. Not all odors are toxic. And so while there may be some episodic events where there's some odors and some may be related, and you smell that hydrocarbon smell in the air and somebody calls in, it may be part of regular operations, and it may be part of what we're contemplating here within the health risk assessment. And it may not necessarily be exceeding that the toxicity level. And Greg, you may want to elaborate on that.
Just before you elaborate, just building on that. If you're saying that under normal circumstances, there will be vapors produced that will reach outside the oil field. Right? Granted, they may not be toxic, and I fully accept that based on the concentration and the time factor. Is there anything you can do to reduce these vapors, these fugitive vapors that are reaching beyond the oil field?
Well, there are a number of measures that are taken. I mean, they're required to do their quarterly, measuring of all the equipment within the oil field to ensure that they're reducing fugitives. There are requirements within the CSD for reducing all the potential dust and particulates that may be coming from the field by watering regularly and things of that sort. So there are mitigation measures already in place. And then, sorry, Greg, just please do a better job than I'm doing.
I think you've touched on it. We've touched on it a number of times that this report is really looking at the normal operations. And, one of the reasons these are done as part of the AB 2588 and the CEQA analysis is if you demonstrate that normal operations are generating a problem, meaning cancer risk or acute risk or chronic over the thresholds, then you start looking for mitigation measures, things you can do, which might be more aggressive. 1173 implementation instead of quarterly, you do monthly, things like that. But we're not necessarily demonstrating that there's a problem here with our normal operations, even though there is, a contribution to cumulative cancer risk, for example. But that doesn't answer the question about, what happens if you have a spill or what happens if there's a problem. And we saw 2 years ago, we did an additional analysis to try to address those issues. And there was a problem. And that was one of the reasons that we, worked with SPR to implement some additional measures to reduce the frequency and impacts of those. And so there's really two things going on in parallel. And you're right, when this study doesn't look at accidents.
And just one gap that troubles me is that when people say they smell things some distance away, we're never sure if it's coming from another source or it's coming from the oil field. We do wind studies and we do things like that. Is there any, maybe not definitive, but maybe a way we can say, it's a low probability that it came from the oil field or it's a high probability? Because sometimes people smell things a mile away and the oil field gets blamed, rightly or wrongly. Is there any way we can shed more light on these odors that may or may not be dangerous or may or may not be oil field related? It's a rhetorical question.
Certainly using the meteorological data, that's one of the reasons that part of the EIR, we recommended they put in a met station there at the site so that we can understand better, where the odor complaint is, where the odors are being smelled and what direction the wind is moving. And that's certainly one way to understand if the odors are the source at the oil field or not.
A perimeter, just a monitor on the perimeter. I understand what you've done, but an area monitor right at the perimeter would be very quickly able to say that at this time period, if it samples every 10 minutes, the maximum hydrocarbons was such and such in the direction of that. And I think you're required to do perimeter. Yeah. And anyway, thank you very much.
Sure.
I respond to most of those odor complaints. That is, I'm submitting the report to Edgar and everybody else. And, we look at the meteorological data at the time of it and so forth, and the location where it occurred. And again, most of those we could attribute to other sources. I mean, it's not from us, I'll say. And the other thing is we try to do our best to find, if there is an issue, even if it's not from us, to check on the field to see if there's a source it's potentially coming from. And that's really kind of the best method is really to see, well, heck, do we have a piece of equipment that is causing this? We want to stop that first. And so I'm just saying, all in all, I think what we're doing is a pretty reasonable job in that regards. And so we're definitely trying to find the source. In most, if not all cases, we just can't find it. Now, we had a couple situations, I think, where we had a belt burn up on a pump, more recently, and actually the residents were really helpful for us to identify those. So I just wanted to state that.
Thank you.
We got a question from Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Edgar. Thanks for your indulgence, and I'll try and keep this really brief. This question actually incorporates some question from Miss Christine from the Department of Health, if she's still with us. I have a concern as far as the carcinogens for all of our neighbors, but in particularly the neighbors to the east of the Inglewood oil fields. The question is, given the studies that were done by the Department of Public Health, given that it came back with a inconclusive result, did the study include the known commodity of especially Black men that do not necessarily participate in studies about cancer in particular, given the high rate of prostate cancer within the Black male population? Whether or not those types of factors are taken into consideration when the study is actually, because you can't basically get the results of a study unless you're given the information from the populace. I received and sent back the information requested from SC during my battle with and after cancer. And I know of at least three men on my block that are suffering or have suffered from cancer, from prostate cancer in particular. I'm listening to some of the other neighbors describe their personal experiences with cancer as well. It's not a matter of not having faith in the model that's been presented. But as we know, there's lies, damn lies, and then there's statistics. And what we're hoping to be able to come up with is some way of matching what people are expecting to be the case based on a model versus what is actually the case within the neighborhood. So that's the question. Was the overall study done with the full knowledge of cultural differences and collecting data for a study like that?
It's a very good question, and those are very good points. I think one of the weaknesses of the study was the response rate. So when they did actually try and get information from people living in the community, they didn't get a great response rate. And so I want to say it was lower than normal, and it was based on a phone survey. So, and that brings up the issue of, I believe, what the community was most unhappy with was the methodology. They weren't necessarily saying that we don't like these results. They were saying, from what I have heard from the community has been saying, we don't think these results were sufficient, didn't take into account sufficient factors, and like the ones that you just mentioned. So my answer would have to be probably not. That was probably another weakness of the study. And going forward, we'll talk about, Sonia will probably give an update on the next study that's going to be done. We're going to try and learn from that so that we approach that better this time.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we're running a little bit out of time. We got 2 more questions on this, and then we could move on to the next item. We'll call from CARB's team. We have Robert Prager. You're muted on your side, Robert.
Oh, there we go. Oh, thanks. I was wondering what was going on there because I couldn't mute. I couldn't. I was kind of blocked for that. So, anyway, thank you. Yes, I just wanted to give an update, kind of on what we're working with here at CARB. I know you talked about the HRA and it was very interesting, very engaging. So I appreciate just the information that was presented on the HRA for the oil fields. What I want to just mention real briefly is kind of our work that we're doing with chrome plating. And we're looking to amend our chrome plating ATCM to find different ways to reduce emissions of chrome plating at chrome plating shops and within communities. And specifically addressing a lot of the chrome plating that's going on in environmental justice communities as well. So it's obviously a lot of the chrome plating shops are located in these areas. We are holding our second work group meeting, and that's going to be next week, next Thursday, as a matter of fact, at 10 a.m. in the morning. If you would like, I could send you to the link to that work group meeting if you want to participate. I can certainly do that. We are interested in obviously bringing in a number of environmental justice communities into the conversations and into our work involving amending our regulation for chrome plating. So that's one topic I just wanted to mention to you guys. And if you are interested in participate, we would love to have you join the work group. The work group meeting is a technical work group meeting, which consists of not only environmental communities, but obviously industries, local air districts, including the South Coast as well, to provide information and comment and express your concerns over some of the issues in the topics related to chrome plating. So with that, if you have any questions, I can certainly answer those in the short time frame we have, but I just wanted to leave that out there for you, and I will send a note to I think Jose Saldana is our environmental justice liaison, and he can get that links to you.
Okay, thank you. Given that this is a little bit outside of the scope from the oil field, we'll ask if you have any questions to reach out to CARB independently. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you.
Monica?
I think Greg would be best to touch on that, if you don't mind, Greg.
Yeah, it's so generally the health risk looks at three different things: cancer, and which is over a 30-year time frame, and they're looking at carcinogenic materials, and then chronic impacts, which are also over a longer time frame, a year, 12 months or more, but produce non-cancer impacts like asthma. And then acute impacts, which occur over the course of an hour or less, and can create problems in terms of a whole range of different things that chemicals could do, from breathing issues to eyes to skin And it looks at all of those together. And so, yes, we do look at all three of those as part of a health risk.
Yeah, so as Luis explained earlier, we're gonna have discussions on this report. There's a lot of data here. So we're gonna continue with the periodic review and looking to move forward with that with early next year. I'm hoping to get that completed within the first quarter of next year to get moving forward. So we're gonna continue having discussions on this. Like we mentioned, we're gonna get more questions on this report next meeting. So we'll continue having discussion and try to get finalize the periodic review, hopefully by first quarter of next year.
And a small point of clarification with regards to the statements regarding the characterization of the health studies. The first is that there was 2 health studies that were conducted by DPH. The first health study that was conducted was a simple comparison between the USC data and the census tract data that surrounded the oil field. And my characterization of that study, that is the study I was talking about. There was a subsequent study that was conducted that DPH did that Christine was referring to that did actual surveys. And I do believe that the correction was being made regarding that specific study. The first study and the comparison that was done found that there was no statistical difference between the area that they looked at, the census tract data, and the USC study for the county at large. And so, and you know, it's not a subject of debate, and I don't think anybody's interested in going back and forth. I think that study is available at the county's website. And so we invite you to look at it and make a determination as to whether that is accurate or not. I mean, I think that especially in this day and age, it's really important for people to educate themselves and to read as much as they can and to look at all these documents. Some of them are complex and some of them are subject to interpretation. But the characterization that was given for that first study, which is in relationship to the question that was asked earlier tonight, was adequate and accurate.
Actually, Christine has a comment on that. I don't know if you can bring her over, but she's also noting that even with that study, it didn't have the, it wasn't powered enough to find the difference. Is that correct, Christine?
Yeah, I'm afraid I disagree, Luis. There isn't enough within the area that was studied around the oil field. There isn't enough occurrence of cancer. I mean, it's a sample size issue. So the cancer doesn't occur frequently enough to be able to have the statistical power to find a result. So if it doesn't find a result, it doesn't mean that that you've ruled it out. It just means that we didn't have the methodology to find it. So, I mean, yeah, it did show no difference. And, you know, Luis, I'll go back and look to make sure that I'm not saying this incorrectly. I'll go back and look at it, but I mean, there's a sentence in there that's very clearly written by Dr. Reingen that says these types of studies are generally insufficient to find these kinds of differences.
And absolutely. And I think that if you look at it and you go back, I mean, there was an extensive presentation that was done at the time when the study was done. So I think that if you can provide clarification or even bring back that information for the next meeting, I think that will be helpful. I think that we have used a lot of that information. And in fact, I think that we talked about the potential for doing a subsequent study to that one that actually looked at the meteorological data that has been collected over all these years. And instead of looking at census tract data, to look at the specific areas of the residences that could be most highly affected and within a very close distance, say anywhere between 300 to 500 feet, which would be more accurate. And I think we provided those suggestions to DPH to try to be more accurate. But that original study, I mean, it's my recollection, and I will also go back and look at it, is that they could not find, I mean, it was just a direct comparison of census tract data for whatever was presented for that specific area. So it wasn't as if you were out there collecting data or you were not conducting surveys for that particular study. You were simply looking at raw data of the tract data, the census tract data surrounding the oil field, and comparing that to the county at large. And if you look at the numbers, and I remember looking at them very closely at the time, it was an important study to look at, there was no statistical difference between one and the other. And it's not
because we did not have the statistical power.
Okay, Liz, I'm not an expert. This is Liz, but I've been on the Health Study Committee 2 times, and I have attended every one of those meetings where we talk about this at length. And what Christine is saying is what Carrie said before her, and Rangoon, everyone said. It's that we do not have enough data, and we do not have a big enough size to source this to make any representation. And that is why, again, and we, with everybody that was on this most recent health study, will say, you know, while everyone was very concerned about cancer, Charles and I both were saying the number one question is, what about cancer? What about cancer? And the way right now Christine is saying it, that's how all the scientists that were involved, everybody is saying the same thing. There isn't a large enough data source around there, and you can't compare it to all of Los Angeles County. Is that, Christine, isn't that accurate? Or
that's close. I mean, that's close. It's
more of a layman's version.
We need a more specific level of analysis. Like, we need to be able to pinpoint where the cancer cases occurred, like what homes they lived in. As opposed to just doing it by census tract. That's too broad a brush. It needs to be more specific to actual homes. And we can't get that data from, we can't get that data from USC.
I confess not having a great memory, but correct me if I'm wrong. We've already indicated that getting the data back, one of the key points that you recall from the study was that the sample size was insufficient due to the inability to get back the questionnaires that were sent out. The study in and of itself, if we put it into a nutshell, is flawed. So if you are comparing your information for the oil field to a flawed study, you have a flawed conclusion. I don't want to go there. I mean, literally, take it for what it is. They're pointing out that it is as accurate as it needs to be.
The cancer data was pulled, I believe, from the from the LA registry, LA Cancer Registry. The question is, your residence time in the area, are you there for 5 years? I mean, it's situations like that. What was deficient, I am asking in the reports, was what's your general health, that sort of thing. But the actual cancer data, Christine, that comes from the LA cancer database, right?
It does, but it says that you have one case of cancer within census, and that's all the information you have. You don't know if that person was a smoker. You don't know how long they lived there. You don't know any of the other factors that go into what causes cancer. And so to say that, yes, absolutely, the conclusion was that there were not an excess of cancers in those census tracts. That absolutely was the conclusion. But there's a huge caveat that the study was not powerful enough to find it if it was there.
And sorry to interrupt. I know this is a very good conversation, especially about the different studies that have been done in this one. And just for the sake of time, I apologize for interrupting this conversation. And we're going to have more discussions on the health study, and people would want to probably go back to look at those studies to have more knowledge on them and discuss it more. Could we table that for next meeting? Also, the last item for regional planning, I would suggest to table to next meeting. However, the drilling plan, we are on a timeline to move forward with that one. John, David, are you guys okay with moving forward to the
Yes.
drilling plan? Any discussion on that?
Yes, let's do that now.
Okay, thank you. So for this one, I'll hand over to Lisa and Dean in a bit. We do need, I sent it out November 23rd, I believe, to everyone. If you have any comment that you would like to provide, I did give a deadline by tomorrow, Friday, by end of day. If you could provide any other comments aside from anything else you have today in writing to me, so we could include it in the review of this drilling plan. So I'll hand over now to Luis and Dean.
Well, I think you've already covered it. The drilling plan for the proposed for 2021 is nearly identical to 2020, and to the previous years. No drilling's been occurring, so it's been standardized basically for the last 3 or 4 years. We didn't get a lot of comments on it last year. We got a couple comments on the previous year. But part of the process is the CSD wants to hear from the CAP, so we do welcome comments on the drilling plan. But again, they're not planning on drilling, so the plan is sort of a carbon copy from the previous years.
Thanks. So does anyone have any quick questions now that we want to bring up? If not, we could, if you have any comments, please submit them to me by end of day tomorrow, please. I don't see any questions. So we could move forward with, we'll table the next item, the settlement agreement update. We could put that on the next agenda item if anyone has any questions on that. We can move on, John, if you want to the
Let's go to the operator update.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Happy holidays. In November, the Inglewood oil field had a total of 3 rigs working on most weekdays. All of that work was routine maintenance. We had an inquiry from the last CAP into our 800 number. I phoned the 800 number operator and they reported no outages by the operator. So we suspect that caller likely misdialed. We held a supplement to the community meeting, our annual community meeting, earlier in the month. The meeting went well. We had a total of 33 attendees, aside from the 4 personnel that attended from Sentinel Peak Resources. The meeting went just shy of 1 hour. There were 3 questions that required a follow-up that were asked during that meeting, and those individuals who asked the questions received answers via email within 3 days. We have our CAN community alert notification test coming up. Last year when we ran it, there were concerns over the phone numbers that were listed or the lack of phone numbers for CAP members. So if you are a CAP member and you would like to receive a call and or text message as part of the CAN test, please email me your phone number. If it is a mobile number, please also list your cell service provider. If you could email those to me by Monday, December 14th at 12 p.m., I will run the test on Tuesday of next week. So again, please email me by Monday, December 14th at 12 p.m. And my email address is aparsons@sentinelpeakresources.com. That's aparsons@sentinelpeakresources.com. And that concludes the operator's report.
Okay, are there any questions for the operator about this?
I apologize. I missed the meeting. I'm just curious about the 3 questions. Is it something you could share, that the ones that were put by the community that you had to respond to?
I honestly don't have them off the top of my head. I don't know if Dan remembers what they are. I don't recall what they are. I'm sorry.
David, I'll clarify. There was multiple questions. I think these were 3 questions they weren't able to answer during the meeting, correct, Amanda?
Yeah, we just had to research them, but I can't recall exactly what they were at this time. I can look into them and report back at the next meeting.
Is there, I guess, is there a record of the meeting that I could look at? Maybe I could just get all that stuff from there. But yeah, the answers wouldn't be there. So, you know, I just kind of get a synopsis.
No, we did not record the meeting.
Your question, David, does raise a question I had. I thought that the meeting, I was very happy that you held a second meeting. I think with a very short notice and a not particularly convenient time, the fact that 33 people showed up showed that there really was a need for an ability to ask some questions. I was very concerned, though, with the answer to one of the questions that was given. Someone asked about the, I have to look at my notes since this was so long ago, the cost of cleaning up the oil field when the operations ended. And you answered that there was a bond in place that would cover that. And Monica, I believe, later asked, well, what's the amount of that bond? And the answer that you gave was that MRS did a study to determine the total cost of cleaning up the oil field, and that study set the current amount of the bond. And that's not my understanding. I don't believe that's an accurate answer. I wanted to make sure, check with Luis. That's not correct, is you haven't done a study to say how much it's going to cost to completely restore the oil field to its natural state?
Well, back in 2008, or 2009, as part of the compliance effort, we did do a study to figure out a number of things that included removal of all above ground equipment and removal of all equipment that is required to be removed, including above ground pipelines. And we also did an analysis to try to determine, based on other areas where cleanup of total petroleum hydrocarbons has occurred, where there is contamination, we did an analysis to determine what that would cost. And that analysis also took into consideration that there were ongoing remediation efforts at the soil remediation farms at the site. And there was a certain number of cubic yards of material that will be remediated every year. Now, we all know that there was a stoppage in time of that progress. And as a result, when the new operator took over, there was no remediation going on. And so we went back and looked at the model that we had used to study and to determine what the amount should be. And because they had not done as much remediation, which would then mean that by the time that the end of life of the field would come, there will be more contamination that would have to be dealt with. And as a result of that, the bond number was upped to reflect that occurrence. So I'm not sure what you mean by a study. I mean, I think we did an analysis. I don't know that it was a published study, John, but we did conduct an analysis to come up with a number based on the cost of removing material and the cost that would be required for remediation. What we did not do because of county council direction about preemption and other issues, is look at the cost of plugging and abandoning the wells, which are covered under the CalGEM regulations and the state regulations, and their bonding mechanisms with that.
So the bond amount that was covered by the study that you did does not include probably the largest number that we're talking about, which is the cost of abandoning 500 wells or however many there are that will need to be abandoned back then.
That is accurate, and it was the reason for that, as I said, is we were directed not to look at that because of preemption issues, and that it was already that regulatory field was already occupied.
Yeah. I'm not seeking to renegotiate that issue. I just think it's unfortunate that a misleading impression was left after the meeting, and it would be good if we could find a way to get the right information to the people who are at that meeting and who aren't listening to this right now.
My only question would go to what John was asking, and that is, I guess the bond amount is one amount, and the remediation or cleanup of the field is another amount. Are they equivalent? Is that what we're trying to say?
Well, that was the impression that was left that I got when I heard the answer, and I think now Luis has pointed out that they're not equivalent. They're looking at two different things.
Well, I'm saying if you separate them, one is the abandonment bond, and the other one is the bond that you've studied on, Luis. Is that one at least equivalent? I'm not. Yeah. Less. So yeah. Go ahead.
So the bond that we designated or suggested to the county to collect is the bond for abandonment or the cost of abandonment of the field, excluding plugging and abandonment of wells.
And how much is that? That's the question.
I don't know off the top of my head. I can look it up if we have enough time.
Don't worry, we'll do it during something else. But yeah, I mean, I was just trying to get the numbers. This is the number for that we bonded, and this is the number that, based on that number, we're close enough to, whereas if it did get shut down, there'd be enough money in the bond to do that part.
Yeah, for some reason, the number that pops in my head is somewhere around $20 million, but I have to check. I don't know for sure at this point. I don't recollect.
We have a question from Monica.
All right.
Given that there were questions unanswered that you all were going to give back to the community, could this correction be added to that?
Sure. I will look into it, but my understanding is that the cost varies from well to well on abandonment. It can cost over $1 million to abandon one well. There's an example here in Long Beach, the city where I live, where it cost over $1 million to abandon one well. So I don't think we can give you an accurate cost on how much it might cost hypothetically to abandon this entire oil field, because we obviously as a business don't plan to have that in our current business model. So, but sure, I can repeat that again at the next meeting and provide those other answers.
Well,
and again, I'd love to reiterate that Sentinel Peak Resources has not drilled one single well on the Inglewood oil field since we took ownership, and no wells have been drilled on this field since 2014. Thank you.
I don't think Sonia's question was going to telling us at another meeting. It was going to responding to the people who were at the previous meeting who perhaps don't attend these meetings. Do you have a list of the people who attended the meeting last week or 2 weeks ago, whenever it was?
Yes, we have a list.
So you could respond to them and say that you misspoke when you gave this answer and the correct answer is thus and such.
The correct answer is what? I'm sorry, you broke up.
I just said thus and such. I don't pretend to know the answer. I just knew that the answer that we were given wasn't correct.
My answer to that question was that Sentinel Peak Resources is fully bonded under our state requirements and the requirements of the CSD. And I stand by that answer. I don't believe that it's a misspeak at all.
What you said, because I wrote it down, was that MRS did a study to determine the total cost of cleaning up the oil field, and that set the amount of the bond that Sentinel carries, and that was not accurate.
I disagree, and I appreciate this dialogue.
We have a question from Kinkinji.
It's a clarification question. The figure that we were given, $6.8 million to abandon, excluding plugging, is that per well, or can you be a little bit more specific about the figure?
It does not include plugging and abandoning wells. It's simply the cost of removing above ground facilities and remediating the site.
So you said the abandonment and plug were not included, the cost for those two were not included in that 6.8 million.
That's correct.
Okay.
That is correct. The amount to plug and abandon all those wells would, as sort of alluded to by Amanda, it could exceed $500 million.
For the entire field, is that what you mean?
It could, yes. There are some wells that are very costly to abandon. Others are a lot cheaper to do. And, just a quick point is that the county is, through their strike team efforts, is looking at abandoned wells, and the county may have some recommendations as part of that strike team effort to try to perhaps influence, Sacramento or and look at how to deal with the issue of wells that are left orphaned. Obviously, that's not the case here. We have an operator that is currently operating the site, and as they're going, they're also plugging and abandoning their wells. But it's certainly a very large issue, and is an issue of concern to the county, and the county will have some recommendations and hopefully some action related to this issue for all the orphan and abandoned wells at large in the county.
I think even a statement about that, right? Like, it's that the 6.8 million will pay for and all the things you listed, but that there will be other costs above and beyond that. I think that's the confusing part. And I wasn't at the meeting, so I don't know how people left, but the concern is if people left thinking, oh, it's only going to cost not only, that's a lot of money, 6.8 million, when it could really cost much more than that because of the abandoned wells.
I have a quick concern about the statement that an abandonment plan is not part of the business model. I understand the meaning, I think the intent, but as a practical matter, an abandonment plan is a requirement under the CSD should the oil field ever plan to shut down. And while you're not planning to shut down, there should be the financial capacity when you do to complete an abandonment plan, not merely file one. So I'm a little alarmed by that statement. I don't know if there's much we can discuss here other than we need to find an avenue to ensure that there's financial capacity should there be an end of life situation, which happens to every industrial use, extractive industry. I've never actually seen one where there was financial capacity when it was time to submit an abandonment plan. And Ms. Parsons, I'm sorry, but your statement really alarmed me just now. Because I think I've never heard an operator who is currently solvent say that they did not include that as part of their business plan.
Abandoning operations and shutting down the oil field at this point in time is not part of our operations or in our business plan. It's not in our business plan at this time. I'm sorry that that is alarming, but we don't have that in our business plan at this time.
Right. It's not, I'm not making a point about the wisdom of extracting fossil fuels or the viability. I'm just saying that there will come a time in every business. I used to be a bankruptcy lawyer where you know, you may have sustained low prices. You may have a casualty event. It should be, because law requires you to submit an abandonment plan when you do plan to shut down, even if you don't now. You know, that implies that you have the financial capacity to complete an abandonment plan, not that we all on this call get stuck with that bill. So I'm not alarmed by the philosophical idea of continuing operations. I'm alarmed that what you're saying suggests you're intentionally not planning to meet those obligations.
I think this conversation has probably gone into an area that's misleading everybody. When Amanda says that we don't have this in our immediate business plan, people are asking for firm abandonment numbers, and it's just information we don't really release, even if we had it worked down to a high level of detail. We do a reserve study or a depletion study, and in that depletion study, we include all of our expenses, including abandonment, all the way to the end of life. So those studies are done. We just simply don't release that type of information.
Hey, Dan,
personally done the Inglewood one.
Dan, I think it's reasonable for all of us to be a little shell-shocked based on the current news reports that we hear about the Exide battery plant in East Los Angeles. So to be thinking about this long before something like that occurs, I think that all these questions are very relevant.
Oh, I would agree with that. I mean, it's a deal. I'm not saying that the questions are irrelevant. It's that we don't have any near-term plans for abandonment, but we do a depletion study that includes all of the costs, and that would include all the abandonment costs, removal of facilities, soil remediation, and everything.
When the wells are shut down, when they're abandoned, are they put in a state where those, if in fact there was an end of life for the Inglewood oil field, the abandoned oil fields, are they actually abandoned to the point where they could be completely remediated or considered to be remediated and not need any additional attention to them?
We're required by regulation to do that. Okay. Yes, we're required by regulation to do just that.
Great.
I think the point, though, and I think, Dan, thank you for stepping in and clarifying that you guys are aware of the liabilities and the legacy that is inherited when you purchase the field. Old dirt, new dirt, old wells, new wells. That's all on your ledger. I guess what the answer won't come is, are the financial resources available to deal with it if in fact end of life came earlier than your projections?
I'm not sure, David, if there's anything I can say right now that's going to give you total comfort. Yes, we believe that there's the resources will be there. You're asking me to look 30, 40, 50 years into the future. But today there's a plan, and Sentinel Peak Resources can meet all of their obligations under those plans.
Okay, well, if that's, I thank you very much for stepping in and clarifying that. As I said, my concern was for the people who came away from the last meeting with the wrong impression. But we are past our 2 hours, so let's move on to the last substantive issue that we have, which is a health working group update. Sonia, is there anything that you want to report, or anyone else?
Yeah, just really quickly, I shared the link of where all the documents are. If you're not familiar with the flow chart that talks about the process, that's on there. And we're basically at the end of phase 2, which is the scoping. Just to note that the county has been working on a solicitation for a contractor, an evaluation contractor that will come on and do the health study. That is currently with contracts and grants. Then it'll go to county council. The expectation is that solicitation will be released in January. And just to note that it is going to their, I forget what the name is called, but their list of approved evaluation grantee or evaluation consultants. And that at that, once the solicitation is released, then the county will also be able to release a document that gives a summary of the entire process that the steering committee went through, notes on the meetings. The steering committee is also working on a page, a cover page to that to give some explanation to some things, but that can't be released before the solicitation because it impacts I forget what it's called, but like, anybody could get information that then would help them apply for the contract, whatever, but it has to be released when the solicitation is released. So that's where we are. Hopefully it'll still move forward in January, but with COVID, things can be pushed back, but that's the plan right now, that at some point in January it will be released.
Okay, any questions about that? Going once? No, thank you very much, Sonia. We have sent out to all the members the minutes for October. Unless there's some objection, we will consider those approved.
John, there was a comment that I received and I shared it with Dean, who helps us draft the minutes. The comment was regarding the question that came up last meeting for the 1-800 number. That was, I believe, was addressed during the operator update. Tim, would you still like to suggest to include that comment into the minutes, or are you okay with just including it in the minutes for today's meeting?
Please include it in the minutes.
Okay, so the comment was including the question regarding looking into the 1-800 number that the individual who called in and the number didn't work. So I'll ask Dean to, and we'll include it in the minutes. So that'll be the only comment. If everyone's okay with that, then we can move forward with approving.
Okay, so they'll be considered approved with that addition that you will make. Thank you very much. Our next meeting is January 28th, and we will go back to the settlement agreement, which you didn't get to, and again, take another look to the extent people want to at the health risk assessment, and who knows what else. In the meantime, everyone have a Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, Happy Hanukkah, and whatever else you're celebrating.
Thanks so much, John. Take care.
Good night. Happy holidays.
All right, good night.
Happy holidays.
Stay safe.